Sorry, that. See, your friends are thinking just don't want to bother the people next door. And usually what Arpillera means is a three-dimensional textile picture, okay? But it's taken on sort of this political meaning, and in particular, it refers to these fabric textile things, which are much cruder than this. This is what I got from Peru, and I'm totally in love with these. But originally, they were used to connote the arpilleras that were produced in the 70s under General Pinochet in Chile, and I'll give you some sense of what that was like in a minute. Okay, so do any of you know about arpilleras before I start? Good, because I don't know that much. So I was like, if I'm talking to experts, I'm in huge trouble. Okay, so how did I get involved with them in the first place? Okay, first of all, I love crafts. I love to sew, I love to knit. I love crafts, and I'm also like really into women in terms of economic development. My master's is in international relations, and so I really feel that women have a big role to play in economic development. And from there, I sort of got interested in how women get involved in protest and in political revolutions and social movements. So I was over at St. Christopher's Episcopal Church in Gladwin several years ago, and they had like this Azalea Day. It's like their spring fair, and they had these, and I was just entranced. I thought they were the cutest things ever. Okay, and so then I started finding out more about them from the people who were selling them, and then I just really got involved. So these particular Arpillera, okay, were marketed by a sister, Barbara Cervenka, and she's an Adrian Dominican sister, artist and associate professor of art at Siena Heights University in Michigan, okay? And in 1989, she actually went to it's basically a slum. It's a shanty town outside of Lima called Pamplona Alta, and that's where these are from. And she met some of the women that were doing this. Her order has a venue in Pamplona Alta and works with the women. And she began to sell their work on a very informal basis. It was really hard to get the work out. It was hard to get the money back in. But she started taking them to churches and parish fairs and, just libraries, that kind of thing. And she also started a traveling exhibition, which is called, now I'm going to murder the, oh no, I won't yet, Quadros of Pamplona Alta, Textile Pictures by Women of Peru. And it's been shown all over the United States. It's been at the Field Museum in Chicago. It's been at the Textile and Art Museum in Toronto. So it's been around. I tried to get it for the gallery because I thought it'd be so cool to have like a whole room full of these things. Okay. And then what happens is there's a group called Fundades, which takes the money. It's actually a organization for disabled kids, but they take it and then they distribute the money that comes in to the rest of the women's groups that do it. Okay, so that's how I got involved in it. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about women and protest, right? Because women go way back, and one of the earliest times was back in 216 BC. I'll be really brief on the history, but it is very cool. And there was something called the Oppian Law, O-P-P-I-A-N law. So what happens is Rome is fighting Hannibal and Carthage. If you've had history like this, and they're doing really badly, and a lot of men are killed, and there's a lot of widows and daughters coming into money because all the men have died. So the Roman government decides, well, wait a minute, we need their money. So they passed the Oppian Law, which meant that women, all their money became controlled by the state. All right, it wasn't theirs anymore. And then there were a couple other provisions, like they couldn't wear purple because that was a wealthy color, and it was also the color of widows, and we didn't want to play up how many widows there were because that meant Rome was losing, not a good thing, that kind of stuff. And so fine, the women are fine with this. We're as patriotic as the next guy, let's use our money to support the Roman troops. But in about 201, Rome starts to win. So by the Second Punic War, the women are doing, Rome is doing well, and the women notice that all the people outside in the suburbs of Rome are now able to have their money back. So they're like, hello, we would like our money back. So in 195 BC, some of the members, now we're all male in the Roman tribunal, that's not the Senate, but it's sort of the governing body, decided to eliminate this law so the women could have their money back. And the women really got interested in this. Well, what happened is some of the guys in the tribunal said, we like getting all this money from the women. We like having the government control it. We're not going to repeal it. At which point the women really, really got upset. And there is actually a historian, a contemporary historian from the time who described the protest. And he says, the matrons, whom neither counsel nor shame nor their husbands' orders could keep at home, blockaded every street in the city and every entrance to the forum. As the men came down to the forum, the matrons besought them to let them too have back the luxuries that they had enjoyed before, giving as their reason that the republic was thriving and that everyone's private wealth was increasing with every day. This crowd of women was growing daily, for now they were even gathering from the towns and villages. Before long, they dared go up and solicit consuls, praetors, and other magistrates. When the speeches for and against the law had been made, a considerably larger crowd of women poured forth in public the next day. As a single body, they besieged the doors of the tribunes who were vetoing their colleagues' motions, and they did not stop until the tribunes took back their veto. After that, there was no doubt that the law would be repealed. So clearly effective even that far back. And then, you know, as you know, if you look at the French Revolution, if you look at the American Revolution, if you look at women's rights, you look at, you know, civil rights, you look at gay rights, you look at Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the Million Mile March, the women who are down picketing in front of some of the gun shops in Philadelphia. You know, women have power, okay, and they use it. Now, what I want to do now is talk about the kind of origin of the Arpillera under Pinochet in Chile. And I just want to show you a little piece of this video because it kind of, I think it portrays the situation way better than I can with words. So let me see if I can get it. Wait a sec, I thought I had this, but clearly not. So this is Chile under Pinochet. He was a dictator. He came in, knocked out all the democratic institutions, and what they did is they arrested a whole thousands and thousands of men.
This is the story of how a group of women defied a dictatorship. They were armed only with scraps of cloth, sewing needles, and the overwhelming desire to find their sons, husbands, and brothers who had been arrested, tortured, and disappeared by a military junta in Chile. 2 decades later, these women are still searching, and the patchwork tapestries that they created out of their anguish have become a handmade chronicle of life in a dictatorship. Their quest for their missing relatives inspired women from both North America and Europe to join them in their struggle for justice and survival. And with help from the Catholic Church, they covertly sent these fabric portraits of terror around the world.
So you can see how much cruder and less
During the
pleasant
dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet, at least 2,000 people disappeared into Chile's jails, concentration camps, and torture centers, never to be seen or heard from again. And because the military refused to admit that they held them, they were called the disappeared. 3 of the women of the disappeared are Doris Menaconi, the mother of Miguel Pizarro, who disappeared in December 1975. Violeta Morales, the leader of a sewing workshop and the sister of Newton Morales, who disappeared in August 1974. And Inelia Hermosillo, a retired chambermaid and the widowed mother of Hector Tito Garay, who disappeared in July 1974. September 11, 1973, Santiago, Chile. A military junta led by Augusto Pinochet overthrows the elected government of President Salvador Allende. As the junta declared itself in charge of the country, it closed Congress, shut down the free press, and suspended all civil liberties. In a matter of days, over 40,000 people were rounded up across Chile. A reign of terror began. Newton Morales, a 39-year-old chemical worker and union leader, was among those taken. His sister is Violeta Morales.
Mi hermano fue sacado, secuestrado de
Just want
su
to give
casa
you an
en
example of what
presencia de
these
mi
women
madre,
had to deal with, and then I'll...
cerca de las 9 de la noche, por 3 individuos de la DINA. Le toman del hombro y le dice, un momentito, vamos a conversar con él y ya se lo traen.
So you can see how in the quadros and the Arpilleras, she's basically put the story, it's
Hector
called a
Tito
narrative
Garay
text.
was a 19-year-old student when arrested. At the time, he lived at home with his mother, Enelia Hermosilla.
A mi hijo me lo sacaron de aquí. Yo decía, soy madre y tienen que decirme qué pasa con él. Me dijeron que no bajara porque iba a tener consecuencias, pero yo seguí bajando, no me importó nada. Aquí está la camioneta. Bajo yo y veo que a él lo echaron a la camioneta. Y yo vengo y me voy a tomar de aquí, de atrás de la camioneta. Me tomo de atrás de la camioneta y ellos de adentro me dan el puñete. Y el otro que quedó ahí a la orilla del lago, viene y me dan una patada y me caigo.
Arrests were followed by brutal interrogations, torture, and in some cases, death. Bodies were found lying in the streets, floating in the Mapocho River, thrown from helicopters. Others were dumped into unmarked graves.
Okay, so that just, I think, gives you sort of a flavor of what it must have been like, you know, to live then. There's a woman named Marjorie Agozena who has written a whole book on this whole phenomenon or whatever. And what she writes is, these Arpilleras of brightly colored scraps speak of pain and also of hope. With their big round suns and the peaks of the Andes framing the background, these simple cloth pictures, assembled by women, some illiterate, some from the upper levels of society, travel to the far corners of the earth, because remember, they're selling them. Speaking for those who have no voice, each Arpillera completed and sent outside the country is another link between the oppressed people of Chile and the free outside world. The women who make them use their pain to try to forge a just society for all. That is the message to the rest of the world from these women warriors for peace. And then she quotes one of what they call the Arpilleristas, the women that do it, who say that as long as they live, they will continue to sow Arpilleras, to dispel oblivion, to make the dead speak, and to regenerate a collective memory. Now, interestingly, you have all these women now who are widowed, they don't have, you know, they're brotherless, but they also don't have any means of support, so they're in really bad shape. And the Catholic Church, bless its heart, was one of the first groups to get in there and help. And it started what's called the Becaria de la Solidaridad to help these widows and mothers, primarily economically. But what happens is, as they start to sow to make money, it becomes therapeutic, and then beyond that, it becomes a way of making a political statement. So I want to talk a little bit about the use of art in protest. Has anybody ever been to South America? I'm just curious, okay? I don't know if you have any protests then, but if you ever see protesting of any form in South America, their props are beautiful. So their posters are amazing. I mean, you know how here, at least in the 60s, when I protested, I might have a peace sign, you know, and it would say peace, that was it. They do beautiful, colorful, they're works of art. And then they also do effigies. We don't do a lot with effigies in this country, but you know, those kind of figures, and they are beautiful. Or they're, kind of reminds you, if you've ever seen a Mummers Parade, it's that kind of caricature. So this idea of using fabric is not foreign to them, all right? there are several things that protest art can do, okay? The first thing is framing, all right? And I should, footnote, because I'm always screaming at my students not to plagiarize, that I'm taking some of this from an article by a woman named Jacqueline Adams. And she says, movements are actively engaged in the production of meaning for participants. In other words, if you're going to get out there and try to create change, you've got to convey the meaning of what you're trying to do. For participants, the people that are on your side, the people that are antagonistic to you, and then also the observers, the people that are the bystander public. And so what art can do is frame or assign meaning to the relevant events and conditions in ways that persuade you to buy into the message. All right, so in a sense, it's sort of a marketing device. It can also show the opposition sort of where they're wrong, and it can gain the good opinion of bystander publics, okay, and hopefully demobilize the enemy in a sense, okay. So as part of the framing, the Arpilleras do several things. First of all, they provided information to the outside world about the conditions in Chile, because Pinochet controlled the media. It's like any other oppressed country. Very often, the people in government can simply shut down whatever is going to the outside world. And when you look at these, you can really see that Pinochet is sort of evil. He's portrayed as evil. And this worked at both an informational level, as in you saw those quadros, you saw the executions taking place, the police dragging the man off. A very common motif will be women dancing, and it shouldn't be women dancing, but there are no men. Or there will be something where there'll be like a Christmas dinner and none of the men will be there. So you're sending out that information to the outside world, but you're also conveying a certain emotional ethos because they're made of very poor cloth. Okay, so that says, these people are poor. Okay, they often use their own hair. I really didn't want the quadros with real hair, I have to be honest. It's like a little bit weird. But it does say we don't have any other way of conveying this, okay? They're crude. You saw how crude they were. Sometimes the spelling is off. The perspective shows no art education. The figures can be childish, which of course says naivete and a lack of sophistication, but also says I'm really sincere. I'm really not trying to be artistic here. I'm trying to get my point across, okay? It also was useful if you were the person in another country trying to sell them, because it was a good conversation piece. So if I had a store and I had those quadros, and you came in, I could say to you, look at these. This really shows you what's happening in Chile. I can get the information, across to you, and it makes the suffering come alive in ways that just reading about it in the newspaper aren't going to do, okay? It also did very definitively portray Pinochet as evil. There's one that I don't have, but I've read about where Pinochet is depicted as the four horses of the apocalypse. I don't know if you ever, it's like one of those motifs. And the four horses are supposed to be famine, war, death, and conquest. And so I've never seen the quadros, I've just read, but apparently it really makes it look as if, Pinochet really is evil, okay? Art, of course, were also, doing it created socialization to the protest movement, okay? So the women would sit around, and while they're doing this, they're talking. And they start talking about the political situation, they talk about what's happened, to their male members of the family. They talk about their feelings, which we'll see later on is really important. And they talk about other ways to protest, okay? And one of the quotes is, activist commitment comes from the creation of an activist identity through a progressive socialization process which involves the creation of solidarity. All right. They also were a good tool for resource mobilization, both in terms of money and also in terms of emotional support. People didn't buy the Arpilleras because they were cute. These are people outside of Chile. They bought them because they wanted to support them. And sometimes they're called the gateway to the heart. And so by giving money, they knew the money was going back to these women. They're supporting them. They didn't necessarily think they were beautiful, but they were making a political statement of support. They also, in buying them, gave the Arpilleristas the resource of sort of hope. Somebody's buying my Arpillera. It matters. I count. People out there care about me because they are buying my work, okay? It was also a way, as I've said, of communicating sort of the ethos or the, you know, the cultural perspective of the protest movement in Chile, okay? When you have an Arpillera and you look at what it's conveying, it is conveying sort of a way to think about how the movement is being, you know, propelled and what the ideals are behind it, okay? And always portrayed in a positive light, you know, from the Arpillerista's point of view. The Arpillera also became a symbol. As I say, now when you say Arpillera, if you're even in Peru, because I was in Peru last June, when I said Arpilleras, there was a political connotation to it, you know, and at one point, they don't have a lot, I didn't find a lot when I was in Peru, but one guy said, well, do you want the political ones or the pretty ones? So they still are some of the political ones out there, but they are a symbol of suffering and a symbol of resistance, okay? And if you were an exile from Chile and you had an Arpillera in your dining room, that meant you supported the protest movement. One of the people who was interviewed who was an exile, you know, he had left Chile, said, you saw that abroad there was not one Chilean who did not have an Arpillera, everyone. I mean, it was a sort of thing to value, perhaps creativity, but also grassroots organizations at the time. A symbol, a really important symbol. And then as a symbol, it unified a lot of other groups that were also involved in protesting, because it's not just these women making these Arpilleras. You know, it's librarians and academics and women running soup kitchens and students, a lot of students involved, and a lot of students died, okay? So it gives this unifying theme. And then a couple other things that it did that were very practical is it was a way to bring in new recruits into the meeting, because you'd see the Arpillera and think, okay, how can I help? What can I do? It sustained the morale and the commitment of the current protesters, okay? It generated positive media coverage. It mobilized the support of bystanders and observers, particularly internationally, all right? It also, and it's interesting because when these started coming out, Pinochet and the military didn't pay them any attention. This was women's work. So why are we paying attention to these little women? They're not important. Well, what happens is they start to see that they are having an impact, but how are you going to go and round up a whole bunch of innocent women who are sitting there sewing? That is going to look so bad, not just to the outside world, but to your own country. So what the Arpilleras did as sort of a symbol was to constrain the options of the opposition in terms of trying to repress them. So, and then it is sort of interesting in a way that it was the Catholic Church, which is primarily, you know, a patriarchal organization, was the underpinnings, you know, the foundation of this women's movement. Now, there is a point at which it's obvious the military do find the women as a force to be reconciled, and there's one member of the military who said, women constitute the most efficient political weapons. They have time, they are capable of great emotion, and they mobilize quickly. For instance, if you want to start a rumor that the president drinks too much, or that he has serious health problems, use women. By the next day, the rumor will be all over the country. So it's not complimentary, but doggone it, we have power. I just want to make one little comment about protest music, because that's another art form. But what you'll find is if you use art, a couple things. One is if you listen to protest songs, you usually have to listen to the lyrics. So if you aren't literate, then you may not be able to read the lyrics. So it's not as effective, but an even more important thing, and why it's interesting, because protest song was really, really important in South Africa when they were protesting apartheid, but much less so here. And they think one of the reasons was that if you're a musician and you write a song, they know who you are. But if you're an Arpillerista and you're part of a big group, you can get that art out there and nobody's going to know who actually did it. And you're not necessarily going to round up a whole group. So in that sense, you know, art can be a little more effective, the visual art like this, as opposed to music, because it can be anonymous, all right? Now, one thing I do want to say in terms of identification is that many of the Arpilleras have pockets, and mine actually do, okay? Now, mine pretty much say something like, this one says something like, this is the mountains of the Andes with sheep. But one of them, and I forget which of these two, has a little comment about, this is what we wish we had. I'm going to get back to that. But on the original Cuadros, there would be sometimes very poignant little sayings, and the one that just absolutely hit me was one of the founders, Irma, of the first Arpillera workshop, did an Arpillera with her son as a little boy running on the beach. And in her pocket she put this message: "When I find my son, I will take him to the sea so he can run barefoot across the sand again." And of course, they never found her son. Okay. Another quote is, "We are here to denounce what happened to us and to put our anguish into the Arpilleras so others will know. Our first motive was to use our terrible pain about our demolished lives." And then, interestingly, there is one man that I've been able to find who's actually done work on these, and he writes, "It would be wrong to think that the process was easy or simple. To form any kind of organization, to get together at all in Chile after the coup was dangerous. There was not only stark fear to overcome, the junta was spreading an ideology of consumerism and individual competitiveness even among the poor. So it's like, don't work together, be out for yourself." And then he says, and then there was the traditional Latin/male chauvinism. It says, "Many women became involved to begin with only from dire necessity, but as the movement spread, its therapeutic function changed to one of conscious communication, not only with one another, but with the world outside. Many believe that the revival of popular organizations in Chile and their first great boost at the demonstrations of 1978, which moved public opinion so much, came partly at least from the meetings of the families of the disappeared and the shanty town dwellers who met for the purpose of making Arpilleras." All right. And then another comment is, "The Arpillera assumes a unique identity in Latin American history. It is a courageous piece of needlework that transfigures experiences of grief and searching into a fabric of memory, managing to engrave itself upon Chilean culture by converting female submission and reserve into nonviolent yet denunciatory weapons." So that's Chile, okay? But how do you get to those? Okay, I bought those 4 years ago. We're talking about Chile, in 1972 to 78. So what happened was, eventually Pinochet is overthrown, okay? In 1990, he gives up the presidency. And then you don't need that Arpillera as protest anymore, okay? So people aren't going to buy it in support of a movement that, just isn't happening anymore. It's accomplished its mission. And the new buyers who did like just the art form did not want ugly pictures of, as one guy says, I mean, people realize that if you want to sell things, you've actually got to sell something that's bright and cheerful, because people don't want to put prison art on the wall and communities of people being shot. So, that makes sense. These women still need economic help. They still need to make money. So they start to switch to more attractive, much more similar to this, the kind of almost cute, idea, non-political themes. And this is the style that gets transplanted to Pamplona Alta. Now, Pamplona Alta is a slum outside of Lima, or shanty town. Slum has got kind of a different, I think, aura to it, okay? What happens is that in the late 70s, many of the indigenous people and people that lived outside of Lima start coming to Lima because they don't have water, or they don't have social services, or they don't have schools, they don't have infrastructure. So they're the first group to come. And what do? They build outside the city. I have this very bad picture, which I actually was going to blow up. If you look at that sort of carefully, if you're in Lima and you look around, the hills go up around, it is like, as far as your eye can see, these kind of little tiny buildings, like shacks, okay, that are there. So what happened is, as they came, they just threw up whatever they could, okay? And then in the 80s, in Peru, you have the advent of a lot of Marxist guerrilla groups. The most scary one was the Shining Path, and they still talk about the Shining Path today. I was nervous they were gonna reinvent themselves while I was there. It was a little bit nerve-wracking. And so what happened was a lot of these Marxist guerrillas who were opposing the government went into villages to get food, and they would terrorize the inhabitants of the village, and then the government would send its forces in, and it'd be, the villages became battlegrounds. A lot of the men were killed, or they were, taken off, and they also disappeared. There was sort of a culture of the disappeared as well in Peru, and families lost their farms because they were completely raised by the, one side or the other. They lost their cattle, they lost their children, they lost their parents. So many of them came, again, we've got more people coming into the city, many of whom, in fact, most of whom, were single women. So Pamplona Alta now has about 250,000 people in a not very big space. The homes are made of straw mats, they're made of like corrugated tin, they're made of cardboard. I mean, they would fall down in 2 seconds. They're cold, fortunately, it doesn't get super cold outside of Lima. There's an 80% unemployment rate. The water is brought in by truck, I'll say more about that. And very often, the Arpillera is the only source of income. Now, here's a description from a volunteer from Australia. It says, here in Pamplona, there is no electricity and water must be brought in by trucks. Unfortunately, because the roads are so steep and narrow, because remember they're on the hills, they're on the mountains, okay? The people who live in Upper Pamplona must carry tanks up to their homes. Those are big tanks. I've seen them do it. Even women who are pregnant. It also takes over an hour to walk to a medical post. I can see children digging through the rubbish, this is true, searching for a kilo of aluminum cans in order to try and earn 1 sole. A sole is about 35 cents. This may take all day. Many of the children have skin diseases and stomach problems, and most of them have chest, throat, and nose infections and allergies due to the dusty, intoxicated air. There's this saying that if you drop a spoon in Pamplona Alta, it will just disappear into the sand. So it's just constant, and it's funny, you can even see it when you're far away. You just see this dust, coming up. So when these women came, there were already some people there, but they're met with a lot of distrust, particularly in the city of Lima. They really don't want them around, and so they got to do something. So the first thing they did was set up community dining rooms or community kitchens, okay? And then as they're cooking together, they started developing mothers groups, they started developing, little marketplaces. And in the late 70s, there was a group of about 10 women who were always sewing and knitting, and there's an awful lot of handicraft in Peru. I mean, this still goes on. And they were trying to sell these handmade articles to tourists and people from Lima, not doing very well. And this woman who used to come from Lima, she taught at a place called the Humboldt School, had been sent from Chile 3 Chilean arpilleras that looked more like these. And she said to them, why don't you try these? Let's see if we can market them. And she said, they were so frightened that the group began like therapy. Then a big order came in from the US giving them the income and encouragement to continue making arpilleras. Now, interestingly, at first they tended to depict the problems in the shantytown. So they would show like miners' strikes, all these guys standing outside a mine, the long lines. There is one that's just, long lines of children and their mothers at medical clinics, graveyards of children because so many children die early, and there's the infant mortality rate is appalling, okay? And they also would show how women were getting together to confront these issues, so they'd have the women sitting around. But very, very quickly, they learned this wasn't going to sell. So that's why they've moved, and most of the arpilleras that I saw, other than in museums, where they do show the protest ones, are this nicer variety, okay? There can be up to 50 women in a group. They split the income evenly. Each sale brings about $5 to $25 to the group. Each woman makes about $1.50 a day. They market here, if you can find them, between $50 to $120. So somebody's making money off of these. I'm not sure it's the women, okay? And they work very hard. There's one woman who said she gets up at 6, she fetches the water. Remember, you gotta walk to get your water. She cleans the house, she walks to the bakery to buy bread, she gets her kids up, she fixes them eggs, she gets them off to school, and they can walk miles to go to school. I saw children in little, adorable little uniforms taking, buses, and I'd say, well, how far is this school? And they'd say, it's an hour away. It's just really hard for these kids to get an education. So then she's, at 8 o'clock, she's working from 8 to 11, and she goes home, she makes lunch, Kids do not come home from lunch if they're that far away. And then she'll go back at 2 and work until 8 or 9 at night. That's a long day sewing, all right? And then they're marketed by different groups, many of which are women's groups that are based in Lima and also another shanty town in which there are a lot of women who are there as political refugees, okay? In the workshops, the women usually talk about the themes they want to convey, all right? And while many of them would like to sort of let the world know that things are not super, super duper in these areas, a lot of them portray what they want life to be like. See, there's a lot of, animals, there's a lot of, veggies, or, if you look at the nativity one, there's just really, beautiful background and, everybody's happy. And one of the women said, we're encouraged to sort of work our dreams into it. She said, I had never thought about my dreams because no one ever asked me about my dreams, So this is sort of a way of getting it out there, okay. Another quote says, the actual manual labor of producing quilts allows these women to express experiences that are difficult or impossible to communicate with words. It permits them to cross language and cultural barriers with people from other cultures and languages. The process of making textile art gives women time to themselves, allowing them to shed pain with their stitches. You knit at your own rhythm, or you sew at your own rhythm, or the rhythm of your group. It is therapeutic to be able to express feelings in cultures where pain and suffering is not much spoken of. Many cultures don't openly express personal or social suffering, and pain is considered a private matter. In Peru, it is relatively private. You do not share all personal things with everyone. The Arpillera thus becomes a vehicle of expression in a public way, helping the makers to go on with living in their often dire circumstances. And I really did find that to be true, particularly with the indigenous peoples. They don't emote a lot. They really are very stoic. So, and if you've ever done, say, I guess most of you haven't, if you've ever worked with your hands, it really is therapeutic. One woman said, the more we work, the more creativity we find in ourselves. In the beginning, I never thought the Arpilleras would help me in my life. But this is an art that has no ending. We are always trying to renew our ideas. We are very proud that our pieces are appreciated and sold. The fact that they are exported is a big compensation. It animates us. We all have a little art in our minds and in our hands. We will leave something as a legacy for society. It will stay behind us in another place in another time. And another really nice reaction was from a woman who was a third-year graduate student at Theological Union. She said, I'm looking for God and finding God right here in Pamplona Alta. These women highlight the key aspects of what good work is all about: community, faith, simplicity, and the ability to create beauty in a powerful way. They are co-creators with God. Now, I really love that concept, but I think it doesn't take us far enough. It's great to be a co-creator with God, but you gotta eat and you gotta be able to feed your kids, okay? So as I said, Pamplona Alta is a very, very poor area, but Peru, as a country, still lags behind much of the rest of the world. 19% of the population lives on less than $1 a day, okay? 51% live in chronic poverty. The mortality rate for children is 32 per 1,000 births, which is high. 7% of children under 5 are underweight, 26% of children are malnourished, and 35% of the population is below the minimum level of dietary energy consumption, which is basically, what do you need to lead 1,200 calories to survive? 35% of people in the group aren't getting that.